Hey all, here at OS Reviews. Today we're taking a throwback look at the HTC U11 here in 2023. This is a flagship Android smartphone launched by the Taiwanese manufacturer in 2017, making it now 6 years old. In many ways it's bittersweet because it was really HTC's last hurrah at the global market, that is, before things really went downhill. These days they come back every once in a while with a mid-ranger, often in the Desire line, and it's only available in Asian markets. So their presence in North America, at least, has dwindled compared to the days where they were the king of Windows mobile smartphones, and they were also one of the first Android manufacturers ever. So it's just kind of unfortunate and just tells you how fickle the smartphone industry is, and it does have a super shiny exterior that's made out of Corning Gorilla Glass both on the front and back, came in these vibrant shades that glimmered, though it was a fingerprint magnet, and because of the curved nature, a little bit reminiscent of the Sony Xperia XZ2 and XZ3, it does have a tendency to slide off of surfaces if you're not careful. The back housed a 12 megapixel autofocus camera with dual tone LED flash, volume rocker, and textured power key were located on the left-hand spine, which by the way is a frosted aluminum, and the bottom here had a Type-C port for charging at 18 watts, and like most HTC flagships from the era, they had excellent audio by form of boom sound. The earpiece served double duty as a second speaker. There was, however, no 3.5mm headphone jack. That was also quite sad, especially for a brand that once put so much emphasis on audio, and the device is capable of high-res audio playback as well, but you would need a 3.5 to Type-C adapter, or you can use Bluetooth headphones. You could still find a couple of noise-canceling microphones located on the edges as well, which also offered some capabilities when it came to video recording, which allowed the phone to zoom into different audio sources, which was a pretty cool audio trick. Now on the front there was a 5.5-inch Quad HD or 2K resolution IPS LCD display, and HTC was known for using some of the highest quality LCD displays at the time. Of course, it doesn't have quite the same level of depth and contrast as OLED or AMOLED, but it has benefits of being more color accurate and also getting brighter in direct sunlight. You also had access down below to a fingerprint scanner, which is quite fast at unlocking the phone, along with some capacitive keys for back and multitasking that were a little bit skewed towards the bottom chin. The top also housed a 16 megapixel camera for selfies. Now, we talked about how slippery this phone is, and that is the cause for why this particular device slid off of a table and the glass has slightly cracked at the bottom corner there. But luckily the phone's touch responsiveness still functions, but it is one of the downsides of having a fully glass-clad phone is, again, it doesn't have quite the same level of endurance as something made out of metal or plastic, and so this is, again, a device that I would definitely recommend putting a skin or a case on for the maximum protection. Nonetheless, taking a closer look at the software experience, this has since been upgraded to Android 9.0 Pie, which is the last OS that it received. It came originally with Android 7 Nougat, so it got 2 generations of OS updates. Not terrible, but also shows how in the Android space it's not quite to the same extent as what you might get on iOS products. Granted, considering HTC's waning popularity and the fact that they pretty much sold their smartphone division, or the bulk of it, to Google, resulting in many of their talent now making the Google Pixel devices. So considering that resources are quite low for HTC at this time, it's also understandable at least. HTC's customization on top of Android, which is known as Sense, was also scaled down compared to earlier generations, but nonetheless some of the live wallpapers that also went with the entire theme of the rounded corners and the curvy design I think looked quite good. These were interactive, and there's also access to Blink feed on the side as an alternative to the Google News feed, although you did find access to quite a few additional social media apps including Facebook and Instagram, even Messenger pre-installed, which luckily you can all disable or remove if needed, plus a handful of HTC's own applications as well, including Alexa for some reason, plus their version of some utility tools that gave it a more customized look. So it's not necessarily the lightest phone either in terms of being most faithful to stock in terms of apps which are included, but also not too bad. Some of these can still be quite useful, including Zoe, which was HTC's video editor tool that came bundled with the phone. There's also a built-in voice recorder, as well as the standard Google apps that you can also find. Now, one of the hardware innovations introduced with the U11 was the Squeeze Edge Sense functionality. So by pressing the phone, you can trigger different commands, including the voice assistant, as well as opening up even other applications, which is quite clever. And of course, this was the technology that was later borrowed by Google on some of their earlier Pixel devices, including the Pixel 2, 3, and 4, all had this functionality. But on HTC software, it offered you a little bit more customization in terms of what functions you wanted to trigger. Squeezing in the camera app also allows you to capture images, since the phone doesn't have a physical shutter key located on the edge. So it was pretty clever, although perhaps not enough to save a company that was no longer really the go-to in the Android space, but still was fun to play around with. Now, speaking of this camera app, very basic, it did provide access to HDR, and this was one of the benefits of HTC's close collaboration with Google. I believe some resources in computational photography got shared between the companies. So the U11 had a significant bump in performance compared to some of the earlier HTC One series phones, such as the One M7, One M8, which all had decent cameras, but resolution as well as processing were both not quite up to the competition. But on the U11, it was kind of back on track. You could also find a handful of additional shortcuts on top for recording video up to 4K, time-lapse footage, as well as also go into a pro mode for changing things like ISO, exposure, even capture in RAW format for further editing. And looking back at some of these results, they are really not shabby. It's not crushing too much details in the shadows either. Again, thanks to the boosted HDR effects, although it was missing other features that came later on, such as, say, night vision or a night mode. Even video recording was pretty decent with optical image stabilization, good processing, accurate colors, and again, very good audio thanks to the multiple microphones, which can reduce ambient noise and focus on a single source. In fact, many of these tricks were even borrowed by HTC's less expensive phone at the time that had a similar design language, the U11 Life, and this was a device that came with the Android One program, so even more clean to Android OS, and also could be purchased with T-Mobile here in the US as well. It was a far cheaper device, but had also a weaker Snapdragon 630 compared to the Snapdragon 835, and a real glass and metal construction versus plastic. The older 16:9 aspect ratio of the display also made for some of the larger chins at the top and bottom of the screen, and a slightly more dated look on the front compared to, even in this time, many of the competition were adopting the taller full screen aspect ratio, which might have also contributed to poor sales of the U11, since from a design perspective on the front, it just seemed maybe a generation behind many of its contemporaries. Regardless, the Snapdragon 835 is an octa-core processor, 10 nanometers in terms of architecture, and really still not shabby here in 2023 in usage, surprisingly. It has relatively good Wi-Fi antenna reception, so pages are still quite fast to load. It is, of course, a 4G LTE device, and other essentials, including NFC, GPS, can all be found present, though the device notably didn't have Qi wireless charging, which was a little bit strange on a full glass device for even the time. Still, as you can tell, simple tasks like web browsing are actually quite responsive, even on more complex pages with lots of videos and ads. And the phone also came with either 4 or 6 gigabytes of RAM, supplemented by 64 or 128 gigs of built-in storage. One other area that HTC's U11 got right were details like the haptic vibrations felt very tight and precise. The phone is also, by the way, IP69, so it's rated against splashes and light water and rain, as well as dust. So in general, system performance is quite good, although I would say RAM optimization might not be quite to the same extent of vanilla Android, especially with some of the additional animations, but as you can tell, the Snapdragon 835 is still mostly keeping up. And now jumping into a quick video playback test on YouTube, loading times are still quite respectable even to this day, though you are dealing with a slightly, again, older aspect ratio. And in terms of navigating around the UI, still feels actually quite fast. I would say it's a noticeable jump in performance compared to the Snapdragon 820, 821, here to the 835. Again, going from a quad to an octa-core processor gets you much closer to a modern overall level of usability. And since it is running on Android 9, you do have access to picture-in-picture mode for multitasking. A quick peek into the settings, you can tell that it's a little bit more colorful and animated compared to stock. You could trigger a glove mode to make the touchscreen more responsive, as well as even the color profile can be further tweaked between vivid and a more accurate sRGB mode. Even the speakers could be toggled between theater modes and music modes for slightly better accuracy versus more stereo separation. And if you connect a Type-C pair of headphones from HTC called USonic, there was also support for active noise cancellation using the phone's built-in microphones, which is kind of an interesting idea. As far as additional apps are concerned, I would say it's not bad when it comes to even doing a bit of light gaming. So titles like Stack, Crossy Bird can all be played actually quite fast on the device. It's quick to load, and generally the phone doesn't get too hot either in terms of thermals, which is good. Granted, the battery on the HTC U11 is a little on the smaller side at 3000 milliamp hours. Plus, with older phones, you have to keep in mind battery degradation. So this is a device that unfortunately is no longer really an endurance champion. It can kind of squeeze through a day of light usage, but you may have to top up in between if you're using it heavily for cameras and also gaming. And generally, I would say similar to, again, using something like a Samsung Galaxy S8 or Google Pixel 2, 2 XL here in 2023. Again, all those devices coming from the same generation with equivalent processors. So that's more or less it as far as our revisited look back at the HTC U11. Again, unfortunate how things have turned out, and hopefully HTC can still make a resurgence if they deliver something with a clean software experience. I think there's still plenty of fans that are clamoring for them to come back. Ultimately, though, I would still probably point you in the direction of slightly newer phones if you're shopping around, even in the budget segment. Like we said, phones such as the S10e, which can be found actually for not too much more than this, hitting roughly the $100 price range will get you a generation newer chipset and processing performance, as well as a slightly more versatile looking camera setup. But nonetheless, it's always fun taking a look back at HTC's creations. You can check out additional details if you're interested in the links down below. For now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the HTC U11 Revisited.